The horrifying case of Eliza Whitlock still haunts the misty valleys of the Missouri Ozarks more than a century later. In 1912, a community once known for its peaceful simplicity became forever marked by a darkness few could comprehend or dare to remember. What happened among those ancient hills would test the very limits of human understanding. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Catherine stared at the calendar hanging in her Springfield kitchen, counting the days since she'd sent her letter to Eliza Whitlock. 3 weeks had passed without response, unusual for her sister, who had always been prompt in their correspondence. The nagging worry that had started as a small pebble in her mind was growing heavier by the day. She must be busy with the children, Catherine reasoned aloud, trying to convince herself as she moved through her bustling daily routine. Her life in Springfield offered conveniences that the isolated Whitlock homestead lacked: neighbors within calling distance, shops within walking reach, and the comforting hum of a growing town. Yet thoughts of her sister's remote existence in the Missouri Ozarks continued to trouble her. Meanwhile, miles away, Thomas Whitlock hammered another board across the eastern window of their farmhouse. His movements were methodical, almost ritualistic, as he secured the property against invisible threats that seemed to haunt only him. The sound echoed through the silent homestead, causing Edward and Mary to exchange worried glances as they sat at the kitchen table. "The winter winds are getting stronger," Thomas explained curtly, when Eliza questioned the need for such measures. "We can't be too careful." His eyes, once warm and inviting, now held a distant coldness that made Eliza shiver more than the February chill. That evening by candlelight, Eliza opened her diary. Her handwriting, once flowing and confident from her days as a schoolteacher, now appeared hesitant as she recorded the day's events. "Thomas installed new locks today, the 3rd set this month," she wrote. "He says it's for our protection, but I cannot help wondering what he fears might enter, or perhaps what he fears might escape." The following morning, Joseph Miller approached the Whitlock property, bringing news of a community gathering. Thomas met him at the edge of the property, refusing to invite the neighbor any closer to the house. "We're keeping to ourselves this winter," Thomas stated firmly, his stance blocking any view of the homestead behind him. "The children have been sickly." Inside, Eliza watched through a crack in the boarded window, longing for human connection beyond her increasingly suffocating home. Later, she noted in her diary, "I feel eyes upon me constantly, even when I am alone. Thomas watches my every move, counts the preserves in the cellar, questions where I've been when I've done nothing but tend to Edward and Mary. I find myself looking over my shoulder, even when I'm alone in our bedroom. This house no longer feels like a sanctuary, but a cage." Catherine would send 2 more letters before taking more decisive action. None would reach her sister's hands. Harriet Bowman pulled her woolen shawl tighter as she approached the Whitlock homestead. Midwife's monthly visits were part of her rounds through the scattered farms of the Ozarks, bringing not just medical supplies, but also the human connection many families craved during the isolating winter months. Snow crunched beneath her boots as she carried her worn leather bag toward the cabin. Through the frost-covered window, she caught a glimpse of Eliza Whitlock moving about inside, her slender frame casting a fleeting shadow. When Harriet knocked, it was Thomas who answered, his tall figure blocking most of the doorway. "Mrs. Bowman," he acknowledged with a stiff nod. "We weren't expecting you today." "Just my regular visit," Harriet replied, forcing a smile. "May I come in? I've brought some herbs for Eliza's headaches." Thomas hesitated before stepping aside, his eyes following her every movement as she entered. The cabin felt unnaturally still despite the crackling fire. Eliza stood by the kitchen table, her hands clasped tightly together. "Hello, Harriet," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's good to see you." The midwife noticed immediately how Eliza's eyes darted toward her husband before she spoke, seeking permission. Dark circles shadowed her once bright gaze, and her cheeks had hollowed since their last meeting. The schoolteacher's natural warmth seemed dimmed, like a candle struggling against a draft. "I've brought news from town," Harriet said, unpacking her supplies while keeping her tone conversational. "The miller's youngest just lost his first tooth, and the general store's getting a shipment of new fabrics next month." As she spoke, Harriet observed how Thomas positioned himself between the women, never more than an arm's length from his wife. When Eliza reached for the packet of chamomile, their fingers briefly touched, and Harriet felt something being pressed into her palm, a folded scrap of paper. Before she could secure it, Thomas moved closer. "What's that you're giving her, Eliza?" Just a recipe for that tea mixture you enjoy," Eliza stammered, her face paling further. Thomas extended his hand. "Let me see." The note fell to the floor between them. Thomas snatched it up, unfolding it with deliberate slowness while Eliza stood frozen. After reading it, he crumpled the paper and tossed it into the fire without comment. "I think Mrs. Bowman has stayed long enough," he announced, his tone polite but leaving no room for argument. "The children will be back from their chores soon, and we have family matters to attend to." As Harriet gathered her belongings, her conscience weighed heavy. Outside, the wind howled through the trees, drowning out whatever Eliza might have tried to say as the door closed firmly behind the midwife. "Not my place," Harriet whispered to herself as she trudged back through the snow, the words feeling hollow even as she spoke them. "Not my family, not my business." But the image of Eliza's frightened eyes followed her all the way home. The January blizzard that swept through the Missouri Ozarks effectively imprisoned the Whitlock family within their own home. For 3 weeks straight, snow piled against the doors and windows, transforming their modest homestead into a fortress of isolation. Inside, Eliza Whitlock moved like a ghost through the cramped rooms, her children's eyes following her every step, as if seeking reassurance that would never fully come. The family huddled around the hearth each evening, but warmth seemed unable to penetrate the chill that had settled in Eliza's bones. Edward and Mary pressed against their mother on the worn sofa, seeking comfort while Thomas paced the perimeter, checking locks that had already been secured multiple times that day. "We need more storage for provisions," Thomas announced one evening, his voice cutting through the silence. "I'll be building a root cellar starting tomorrow." Eliza nodded without meeting his gaze. The former schoolteacher had learned that questions only invited scrutiny. That night, as snowflakes tapped against the bedroom window like tiny fingers seeking entry, she lay awake listening to her husband's breathing, wondering when exactly fear had replaced love in their marriage. The next morning brought a temporary break in the weather. Thomas disappeared outside with tools and supplies, the sound of his axe splitting the winter air. Eliza watched from the kitchen window, noting how he positioned the cellar site just beyond her line of sight from any window in the house. "Mama, why is Papa digging when the ground is frozen?" Mary asked, her small hand clutching a crayon drawing of dark shapes Eliza couldn't bring herself to interpret. "Your father knows what he's doing," she answered, smoothing her daughter's hair while exchanging a worried glance with Edward, who seemed to understand more than a boy of 9 should. That night, and for many nights after, Thomas would slip from their bed when he thought Eliza was asleep. The soft creak of the back door, the muffled sounds of digging, and his return hours later with mud-caked boots became a haunting rhythm that punctuated her sleepless nights. One afternoon, while Thomas had gone to check their property boundaries, Eliza ventured toward the cellar site. What she found wasn't the simple storage space he'd described. The hole was deeper, the dimensions strange. Something about its shape sent ice through her veins. It reminded her of something she couldn't quite name. Returning to the house, Eliza began secretly documenting Thomas's activities in her diary, hiding the pages beneath a loose floorboard under their bed. She noted the frequency of his night excursions, the growing pile of dirt, and the lock he'd installed on the cellar door before it was even completed. "It's just for our protection," Thomas had said when she finally gathered courage to ask about his project. His smile didn't reach his eyes. You never know what might be coming. Eliza understood then that the cellar wasn't meant to keep danger out. The danger was already inside their home. As the bitter winter of 1912 tightened its grip on the Missouri Ozarks, Eliza Whitlock clung desperately to routine. Each morning, she would gather Edward and Mary at the kitchen table, their breath visible in the frigid air of the homestead. Despite Thomas's increasingly erratic behavior, she maintained her role as their teacher, guiding small fingers across slate boards and reading stories by lamplight. "Education is something no one can take from you," she would whisper, her former schoolteacher instincts emerging as she helped them sound out difficult words. But even as she created this sanctuary of normalcy, Eliza couldn't help noticing the changes in her children. Edward, once curious and talkative, had grown watchful. His eyes constantly darted to windows and doors, as if expecting some unnamed threat. At night, Eliza would find him sitting upright in bed, listening to his father's movements outside. When questioned, he would simply shake his head and burrow deeper under the quilts. Mary's transformation manifested differently. The little girl had always loved drawing, but her artwork had taken a disturbing turn. Where once she sketched butterflies and flowers, now her crude charcoal renderings depicted tall, looming figures standing over smaller ones. Houses with boards across windows, doors with oversized locks. When Eliza gently asked about these images, Mary would only whisper, "That's how Daddy likes things." At the local schoolhouse, Miss Perkins noticed the siblings' withdrawal immediately. Edward, who had once eagerly answered questions, now stared at his desk in silence. Mary refused to join other children during play periods, instead huddling in corners with her drawing materials. "Their work has changed," Miss Perkins confided to the headmaster. "Something isn't right in that household." When the teacher finally summoned the courage to visit the Whitlock homestead, Thomas met her at the property line. Standing beside his wagon, his tall frame blocking the path to the house, he listened to her concerns with a tight smile. "Children get nervous from the cold," he explained, his tone pleasant but firm. "It's nothing to trouble yourself about. We're simply weathering a difficult winter." Miss Perkins left unsatisfied, glancing back to see Eliza watching from the window, her pale face quickly disappearing behind the curtain. That evening, as Thomas announced he would be working late on his mysterious root cellar, Eliza made a silent decision. She retrieved her diary from its hiding place beneath a loose floorboard and wrote by candlelight. "I must find a way to protect them. Whatever happens to me, Edward and Mary must be saved from this prison he's building around us. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from." The journey to the Ozarks tested Catherine's resolve as much as her endurance. The bitter winter winds cut through her woolen coat as her rented wagon approached the isolated Whitlock homestead. Weeks of unanswered letters and 2 returned envelopes marked unclaimed had driven her to make this unannounced visit from Springfield, concern for her sister overwhelming her usual respect for privacy. Thomas Whitlock answered her knock with visible surprise that quickly hardened into something else. Wariness, perhaps, or calculation. His forced smile never reached his eyes as he invited her into the parlor, his hospitality as stiff as the frozen ground outside. "Eliza's been unwell," he explained, standing between Catherine and the hallway leading deeper into the house. "The children are resting too. Best not to disturb them." Catherine noticed how his gaze constantly shifted toward the windows, how his fingers tapped against his thigh in an anxious rhythm. "I've come all this way, Thomas. Surely I could at least see my sister for a moment?" The farmer's jaw tightened. Another time would be better. The doctor recommended absolute quiet. "Which doctor?" Catherine pressed, knowing the nearest physician practiced 20 miles away. Before Thomas could answer, movement at the window caught her attention. Eliza stood there, pale as the snow outside, her once vibrant face now gaunt and shadowed. Their eyes met briefly before her sister disappeared from view, pulled back by an unseen force. "Eliza." Catherine moved toward the window, but Thomas blocked her path. "She needs rest," he insisted, his tone hardening. "You're upsetting her with this intrusion." For the next hour, Catherine attempted every approach: reason, reminiscence, even subtle threats of bringing authorities, but Thomas remained immovable. The homestead, once warm and welcoming during previous visits, now felt like a fortress. Every door was locked, every window latched. As daylight began to fade, Catherine reluctantly prepared to leave. The weather would make night travel dangerous, and Thomas made no offer of accommodation. "Tell Eliza I'll write again," she said at the door, studying his reaction. "Of course," he replied too quickly. In the distance, Catherine thought she heard a child crying, Edward or Mary perhaps. But Thomas quickly closed the door, the sound of multiple locks engaging behind her. As her conveyance pulled away, Catherine looked back at the isolated homestead. A curtain moved in an upstairs window, then fell still. The sister who had once shared everything with her now seemed unreachable behind walls of wood and silence. But Catherine's determination only hardened. Something was deeply wrong in the Whitlock home, and she would not rest until she discovered what it was. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Joseph Miller sits in his weathered armchair, his 97-year-old hands trembling slightly as he recounts memories that have haunted him for decades. The camera captures the deep lines etched into his face, each one telling a story of regret that time hasn't erased. "I remember when Thomas Whitlock first started acting strange," Joseph says, his voice cracking with age. "We'd been neighbors for nearly 7 years, our farms sharing that north boundary line. Used to be he'd wave whenever we'd cross paths, even stop for a chat about crops or weather." The elderly farmer pauses, gazing out his window toward where the Whitlock property once stood. Then winter came in 1912, and something changed in him. Started seeing him out at odd hours, digging around that new cellar of his. Even when snow was piled knee-deep, he'd be out there with a shovel and lantern. Joseph recalls how Thomas began turning away visitors with increasingly hostile responses. Folks would bring by preserves or offer help with chores. That was just the way of things back then. But he'd meet them at the property line, never letting anyone near the house. The old man's eyes cloud with memory. Started telling people Eliza was feeling poorly, that the children needed quiet, but something didn't sit right about it. The documentary shows historical photographs of the area, the isolated homesteads separated by dense woods and rolling hills. Joseph points to one image, identifying the peculiar mounds of freshly turned earth he noticed near the Whitlock cellar. "Should have said something," he whispers, regret weighing each word. "But that wasn't our way in the Ozarks. You minded your business, they minded theirs, especially when it came to how a man ran his household." He shakes his head slowly. "That code of privacy. Sometimes I wonder how many secrets these hills have buried." His most haunting memory comes last. One evening while checking his fence line, Joseph spotted Eliza Whitlock standing at the edge of the woods behind her home. She was just standing there, still as a statue, he recalls. Her posture was all tension, like a deer sensing danger. She kept looking over her shoulder, then back at the trees, as if waiting for someone to emerge, or maybe planning to disappear into them herself. The former teacher never acknowledged his presence, and Joseph, adhering to unspoken rules of rural propriety, didn't call out to her. "That was the last time I ever saw her," he admits, tears welling in his rheumy eyes. "Sometimes I dream she's still standing there, waiting for help that never came." Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. "My mind feels like it's wrapped in wool each morning," Eliza Whitlock wrote, her handwriting growing more erratic with each entry. Thomas insists this tonic will strengthen my constitution, but I feel only weakness and confusion after I drink it. The pages of her diary, once filled with hopeful musings about her children's future, now documented a darker reality. She described how the bitter liquid would leave her drifting through the house like a ghost, unable to focus on even the simplest tasks. One night, when Thomas stepped outside to check the livestock, Eliza made her first act of rebellion. She poured the murky concoction into a potted fern by the window. "A small victory," she wrote, "to wake with a clear head." This became her silent ritual, feeding the plants instead of poisoning herself. "The geranium by the hearth thrives on secrets," she noted with grim humor. The atmosphere within the homestead grew suffocating. Thomas began inspecting the pantry daily, counting jars of preserved vegetables and making meticulous notes. He would check Eliza's clothing, questioning why certain dresses showed wear. "You've been outside without permission," he accused one evening, though she hadn't left the house in weeks. Her diary entries revealed how he would follow her from room to room, his footsteps a constant reminder of her invisible cage. "He watches me even as I sleep," she wrote. "I feel his eyes burning into my back." When Edward asked innocent questions about visiting his aunt in Springfield, Thomas flew into a rage, smashing a chair against the wall while the boy cowered. Eliza's internal struggle was laid bare on the pages. "I must endure for my children," she wrote. "They are the only light in this darkness." Yet, even her resolve was weakening. She described moments of confusion, times when she couldn't remember what day it was, or whether she had fed Mary her breakfast. "Am I truly losing my mind, or is this what he wants me to believe?" The diary showed how she began hiding small objects, a hair ribbon, a book of poems, afraid Thomas would take them as he had taken her letters to Catherine. Her world contracted further when he boarded up the east-facing windows, claiming the winter drafts were making the children ill. "The sun barely reaches us now," she wrote. "We live in perpetual twilight." In her final entries from this period, Eliza's handwriting steadied, a sign of her growing determination to resist the tonic's effects. "I must keep my wits," she insisted. "Something is happening with the new cellar, and I need clear eyes to see the truth." Miss Eleanor Jenkins stared at the drawing on her desk, a chill running down her spine, despite the warmth of the schoolroom's pot-bellied stove. Mary Whitlock, usually so quiet and reserved, had produced an image that sent alarm bells ringing through the teacher's mind. The crude crayon sketch showed a woman lying flat, eyes closed, with the simple caption, "Mama sleeping," scrawled beneath in a child's unsteady hand. "Mary, can you tell me about your drawing?" Eleanor asked gently, crouching beside the 7-year-old's desk. The little girl's eyes, once bright with curiosity, now appeared hollow and distant. She simply shook her head, thin fingers nervously twisting the fabric of her worn dress. When pressed further, Mary's face went completely blank, as if shutters had been drawn across her soul. The teacher's concern deepened when she noticed bruising on Mary's wrist. When questioned about it, the child merely whispered, "I fell," before retreating back into silence. Meanwhile, Edward Whitlock was creating his own disturbance. The groundskeeper had found the 9-year-old wandering the schoolyard well after dusk, muttering phrases that made the hairs on the back of the man's neck stand up. "Buried secrets," Edward had repeated, his eyes unfocused. "Papa says we mustn't tell. Papa says Mama needs her rest." When the groundskeeper brought him inside, the boy seemed disoriented, as if sleepwalking through a nightmare he couldn't escape. Eleanor sent 3 notes home with the children. Each disappeared without response. When she attempted to visit the homestead herself, Thomas Whitlock met her at the property line, his smile not reaching his eyes as he assured her the children were simply processing their mother's illness in their own way. "Eliza's taken to her bed with a winter fever," he explained, his tone pleasant but firm. "The children are naturally concerned. I'll have them bring you a note from her when she's feeling stronger." The school principal, after hearing Eleanor's concerns. Contacted the county sheriff, but Sheriff Dawson merely shrugged. "Family matters stay family matters out here," he said, leaning back in his chair. "Unless you've got something more than strange drawings and a boy sleepwalking, my hands are tied. Folks in these hills don't take kindly to outsiders poking into their business." Eleanor tried once more, showing the sheriff Mary's drawing and describing Edward's troubling behavior. But the lawman remained unmoved. "Thomas Whitlock's a private man, always has been," he concluded. "Winter makes folks strange sometimes. Come spring, I reckon things will sort themselves out." The teacher watched helplessly as the Whitlock children grew more withdrawn with each passing day, their eyes carrying secrets too heavy for their young shoulders. While the adults who should have protected them remained bound by the unwritten code of the Ozarks, mind your own affairs and let others mind theirs. The leather-bound diary of Harriet Bowman surfaced in 1973, tucked away in an attic trunk belonging to her niece. The pages, yellowed with age, revealed the midwife's private torment that began in the spring of 1913, just months after her last visit to the Whitlock homestead. "I cannot sleep without seeing her eyes," Harriet wrote in her first entry. "The way Eliza Whitlock looked at me that day, desperate, pleading, haunts me through every waking hour." The midwife described how her professional duties had brought her to that isolated farmhouse nestled deep in the Ozark Hills, ostensibly to check on young Mary's lingering cough. What transpired during that visit would haunt Harriet for decades. As Thomas Whitlock momentarily stepped outside to fetch more firewood, Eliza had pressed a folded scrap of paper into her palm. Before Harriet could react, the husband returned, his imposing frame filling the doorway. The midwife, startled by his sudden reappearance, slipped the note into her pocket. "I felt his eyes on me," she confessed in her journal. "Thomas watched my every movement like a hawk studies a field mouse. My courage failed me completely." She described how the man insisted on escorting her to the property line, his conversation pleasant, but his grip on her arm unnaturally firm. Once safely in her wagon, Harriet had reached for the note, only to discover it had fallen from her pocket somewhere on the property. She never returned to search for it. "If I had only looked at it immediately," she lamented in an entry dated 2 years later. "If I had found the strength to ask Eliza directly what troubled her. My silence was a choice, a cowardly one." The diary entries grew more anguished as rumors about the Whitlock family spread through the community. Harriet documented how she considered alerting the authorities, but convinced herself it wasn't her place to interfere in family matters. "We all chose not to see," she wrote. "The entire valley wrapped itself in the comfort of minding its own business." When news of the family's sudden departure reached her in 1917, Harriet's writing became erratic with guilt. "I failed her," she wrote repeatedly across one entire page. "Whatever has befallen Eliza Whitlock, I bear some responsibility." Historians now consider Harriet Bowman's diary a crucial piece of evidence in understanding how the tragedy unfolded and why no one intervened. Her words echo the collective failure of a community bound by unspoken rules of non-interference, where privacy was sacred even when it sheltered the unthinkable. Catherine stood in the Springfield post office, her fingers trembling as the postmaster confirmed what she had begun to suspect. None of Eliza's letters had ever reached her. The realization hit her like a physical blow. "Thomas Whitlock picks up all the family mail when he comes to town," the postmaster explained, adjusting his spectacles. "Been doing so for months now. Says it saves his wife the trouble." She stared at the man, wondering how such a simple system could become a tool of isolation. The postmaster shifted uncomfortably under her gaze, perhaps sensing the wrongness, but unwilling to question established practice. That evening, Catherine began documenting everything. Her neat handwriting filled page after page with observations, timelines, and growing concerns. The diary, discovered years later in her personal effects, would become a crucial piece of evidence in understanding what happened to the Whitlock family. "I fear for my sister," she wrote. "Something is terribly wrong at that homestead. Thomas has built walls not just of wood and stone, but of silence and control." Desperate for action, she penned letters to the county sheriff, the local judge, and even the governor. Her words grew increasingly urgent with each correspondence. The replies, when they came at all, were dismissive. "Family matters," one official wrote, "best handled privately between husband and wife." Another suggested that women's nerves and winter isolation were likely to blame for any perceived problems. The sheriff promised to look into it when time permits, a promise that would remain unfulfilled for decades. "They refuse to see," Catherine confided to her diary. "A woman's concerns are easily brushed aside, like crumbs from a table. If Eliza were a man, would they listen then?" Harriet Bowman, tormented by her own inaction, began keeping a separate account during this same period. The midwife's journal, discovered tucked between the pages of her medical ledger years after her death, revealed the weight of her conscience. "I should have looked at that note," Harriet wrote. "Eliza tried to tell me something that day, her eyes pleading while her husband stood watching. I pretended not to notice. God forgive me. I chose the easier path." The midwife's entries grew increasingly troubled as winter deepened. "If I had only looked, if I had only spoken, perhaps she would still be here." Her words trailed off into a smudge, as though tears had fallen on the ink. These parallel accounts, Catherine's determined advocacy and Harriet's painful regret, formed a tapestry of missed opportunities. Both women, in their different ways, found themselves silenced by the same forces that trapped Eliza: custom, deference to male authority, and the terrible power of collective silence. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. Catherine's frustration mounted with each passing day. Her letters to Eliza Whitlock remained unanswered, and her growing concern had driven her to make inquiries at the Springfield post office. The postal clerk's revelation sent a chill through her spine. "Ma'am, I recall Thomas Whitlock collecting all the family mail himself," the clerk explained, shuffling uncomfortably behind the counter. "Very particular about it he was." Catherine's suspicions crystallized into certainty. Her brother-in-law had been intercepting communication, effectively cutting Eliza off from the outside world. The isolation wasn't accidental, it was deliberate. Desperate for intervention, Catherine penned urgent letters to the local authorities in the Ozarks region. Her carefully worded pleas described her sister's sudden silence and Thomas's controlling behavior. The responses, when they finally arrived, were dismissive at best. "These are domestic matters," wrote the county sheriff. "Without evidence of wrongdoing, we cannot interfere in a husband's household." The documentary pauses here as a historian explains the social context. In 1912, a woman's voice carried little weight against her husband's authority. The law recognized Thomas as head of household, with near absolute control over his wife and children. Catherine's voice, reading from her preserved letters, echoes with helpless rage. "My sister is in danger. Why will no one listen?" Bank records from the First National Bank of Springfield, discovered during a courthouse renovation in 1973, would later reveal a disturbing pattern. During the winter, Thomas claimed financial hardship. The same winter he refused Catherine's offers of assistance, he had withdrawn substantial sums from his account. 4 separate withdrawals of $25 each, notes the forensic accountant interviewed. That was significant money in 1912, equivalent to over $2,000 today for each withdrawal. The timing is chilling. The last withdrawal occurred just 3 days after the final entry in Eliza's diary. The ledger shows Thomas's signature, steady and deliberate, on the withdrawal slip dated February 18, 1912. What was Thomas preparing for? The documentary presents the question with quiet gravity. The financial records contradict everything he told neighbors about struggling through hard times. Instead, they suggest calculation, resources being gathered for something planned. "He wasn't desperate for money," observes the narrator. He was accumulating it. The camera pans across the yellowed bank records, the neat columns of figures that would eventually help piece together the timeline of Eliza's disappearance. These documents, overlooked for decades, reveal Thomas Whitlock's deception extended beyond his family to the entire community, a web of lies that concealed his true intentions until it was too late. Financial records from the local bank, unearthed decades later, revealed a disturbing truth about Thomas Whitlock's claims of economic hardship. During the winter, when he repeatedly told Eliza they were struggling to make ends meet, bank ledgers showed substantial withdrawals, nearly $500 in total, a small fortune for a rural family in 1912. The timing of these withdrawals painted a sinister picture. The largest sum was taken just 3 days before Eliza's diary entries abruptly ceased. Bank manager William Porter, interviewed years later, recalled Thomas's unusual behavior during these transactions. He was agitated, kept looking over his shoulder, Porter noted in his statement. Asked for small bills, which wasn't common for farmers who typically needed coins for local trading. These financial breadcrumbs contradicted everything Thomas had told his wife and neighbors. While he claimed they couldn't afford coal for heating or proper winter clothes for Edward and Mary, he was secretly amassing cash. The discovery deepened investigators' suspicions about premeditation. This wasn't a crime of passion or a momentary lapse. Thomas had been planning something that required money and secrecy. The ledgers also revealed another crucial detail. Thomas had been gradually transferring ownership of their property to his cousin in Springfield, creating a paper trail that would allow for a quick sale. The cousin, who later claimed ignorance of Thomas's true intentions, had already signed preliminary documents by January. Harriet Bowman's diary, discovered alongside these financial records, contained a heartbreaking entry from February. Eliza mentioned Thomas claiming they might lose the homestead. She seemed confused, said the harvest had been good. I should have questioned this discrepancy. Most damning was the correlation between the withdrawals and Thomas's increased work on what he called the root cellar. Joseph Miller remembered seeing Thomas purchasing unusual amounts of quicklime from the general store, ostensibly for farm use. The storekeeper thought nothing of it at the time, but forensic experts would later confirm that such materials could be used to accelerate decomposition and mask odors. The midwife's final entry about the Whitlocks noted that Thomas had begun speaking of starting fresh somewhere out west by early March. By then, neighbors had already begun to notice Eliza's absence, though Thomas explained it away as a prolonged illness requiring rest. These financial records, when combined with the timeline of Eliza's disappearance, created an undeniable pattern of calculation. Thomas wasn't desperate for money. He was preparing for a carefully orchestrated disappearance, one that would leave no witnesses to whatever had happened in that isolated homestead during the coldest days of winter. In 1917, the Whitlock property changed hands with suspicious haste. Thomas Whitlock arranged the sale through a local banker with minimal paperwork, completing the transaction mere days before the county school board was set to launch a formal inquiry into Edward and Mary's welfare. The timing betrayed his awareness of mounting scrutiny. The children's paths diverged like tributaries from a troubled stream. Edward Whitlock, barely 16, disappeared from the Ozarks without a trace. Records show he enlisted in the Army under a different surname, severing all ties to his past. One former schoolmate recalled seeing him at the train station, a small canvas bag his only possession, eyes fixed on the horizon, as if the hills themselves were chasing him. Mary, only 11 when they left, was dispatched to distant relatives in Nebraska. The young girl arrived with peculiar habits, checking locks repeatedly, hiding food in her pockets, and falling silent whenever men raised their voices. Her cousins noted how she would stare at the cellar door of their farmhouse, refusing to descend the stairs even in tornado season. The trauma manifested in her artwork, which continued to feature the same disturbing elements: buried figures, sealed doorways, and faceless women lying still. Meanwhile, Catherine's quest for answers turned into a lonely crusade. She petitioned local authorities repeatedly, traveling from Springfield to the county courthouse every month until her funds dwindled. "The most maddening part," she later wrote to a friend, "is knowing something terrible happened while everyone looked away." The sister saved every newspaper clipping, every letter, creating an archive of absence, evidence of what wasn't being investigated rather than what was. The new owners of the homestead, the Peterson family, found the property in disquieting condition. Windows remained boarded despite the spring weather, and locks had been installed on interior doors. Most troubling was the root cellar, sealed with stones and mortar so thick it suggested permanence rather than practicality. When questioned, neighbors shrugged. Thomas had always been particular about his property. Joseph Miller, whose land bordered the Whitlocks, admitted decades later that he had considered mentioning his concerns to the new family. "But folks around here mind their business," he explained, his weathered face creased with regret. "That's how it's always been." The Ozarks absorbed the Whitlock story into its land. The mystery might have remained entombed forever, the family scattered to the winds, if not for what would be uncovered 35 years later. The year 1952 brought a new chapter to the long-forgotten story of the Whitlock family. Frank Donovan, a carpenter who had recently purchased the old homestead with plans to renovate it into a hunting lodge, made a discovery that would shake the quiet Ozark community to its core. While tearing down the crumbling wall of the root cellar, Frank's sledgehammer revealed a small compartment that had been carefully sealed behind the stonework. Inside, protected from the elements in a weathered oilcloth package, lay a leather-bound book, Eliza Whitlock's diary, preserved like a time capsule of horror. "I found it wedged between two large stones," Frank later told the Springfield Herald. The pages were yellowed but intact, like she'd known someone would find it eventually. The diary's discovery electrified the region. Newspaper headlines blared across Missouri. "Missing woman's diary found after 40 years," and "Whitlock mystery reopens." Local authorities, many of whom had heard whispers of the case from their parents and grandparents, immediately launched a new investigation. Eliza's final entries, dated just days before her presumed death, revealed a woman fighting desperately against the psychological prison Thomas had created. "He watches me constantly now," she wrote in shaky handwriting. "The tonic sits by my plate each night. I pretend to drink it while he stares. I fear what he intends for me, but I must stay alert for Edward and Mary." Her last entry was particularly chilling. "Thomas has been digging at night again. When I asked about it, he smiled in a way that made my blood freeze. If anyone finds this, please look for me. Please tell Catherine I tried to reach her. Please save my children." The diary became the centerpiece of renewed police attention. Retired officers who had dismissed Catherine's concerns decades earlier now faced uncomfortable questions about their inaction. The county sheriff assembled a special team to reinvestigate the case, interviewing elderly neighbors and tracking down anyone who might have known the family. Meanwhile, Edward had vanished into anonymity after leaving the Ozarks, his whereabouts unknown. Mary lived with her husband's family in Kansas, having rarely spoken of her childhood. When contacted by authorities about the diary's discovery, she initially refused to discuss the matter, the trauma of those years still too raw to confront. Catherine had passed away in 1945, never knowing what truly happened to her sister. Her own journals, found among her possessions, documented decades of searching and unanswered questions. "I failed her," read one heartbreaking entry. "I knew something was wrong, and I couldn't break through the wall of silence." The diary's emergence from its stone prison would soon lead investigators back to the cellar with shovels and grim determination. Eliza's voice, silenced for 40 years, was finally being heard. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. In 1952, the old Whitlock property changed hands once more. The new owner, a young veteran with dreams of restoring the homestead to its former glory, began renovations on the aging structure. While expanding the root cellar for additional storage, he noticed something peculiar, a section of the wall that didn't match the rest. The stones were newer, the mortar different in color and texture from the surrounding masonry. Curiosity piqued, he carefully removed the stones one by one. Behind this hastily constructed barrier, he discovered a small compartment. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in oilcloth, preserved against the decades of darkness and damp. As he unwrapped the protective covering, he found a leather-bound book, Eliza Whitlock's diary, hidden away for 40 years. The pages had yellowed with age, their edges brittle and fragile. But Eliza's handwriting remained clear, flowing script that seemed to pulse with life. Her words reached across time, a voice finally freed from silence. The diary contained entries spanning from 1911 through early 1912, chronicling the gradual unraveling of her life under Thomas's increasingly oppressive control. "He watches me even as I sleep," one entry read. "The children sense something is wrong, but I dare not frighten them with the truth. I fear what Thomas might do if he discovers this diary." The discovery electrified the community. Local newspapers ran front-page stories about the mysterious diary found in the old Whitlock place. Police officials, initially skeptical, found themselves drawn into a decades-old mystery. Eliza's final entries painted a harrowing picture of a woman trapped by fear, yet determined to leave some record of her existence. "I've hidden small tokens of myself throughout the house," she wrote in one of her last entries. "My mother's comb, a strip of my favorite dress. Should anything happen to me, perhaps someone will find them and remember that Eliza Whitlock lived here." The diary revealed a woman of remarkable courage and clarity, documenting her husband's descent into paranoia and control, while maintaining hope that her words would someday be found. Her final entry, dated February 3, 1912, ended mid-sentence. "Thomas has discovered I've been avoiding the tonic. He says we need to." The abrupt ending sent chills through everyone who read it. Catherine, now an elderly woman living in Springfield, was contacted about the discovery. When shown photographs of the diary, she wept openly, recognizing her sister's handwriting immediately. The diary's emergence from its stone prison reignited interest in Eliza's fate, a mystery that had lain dormant for too long beneath the quiet hills of the Ozarks. Mary Whitlock, now in her 70s, sits in a rocking chair by the window of her modest nursing home room. Her hands tremble as she speaks, her voice a soft whisper that occasionally breaks into silence. The weight of memories seems to physically press down on her frail shoulders. "The nightmares never stopped," she admits, staring at something beyond the interviewer. "Even now, I wake up hearing Father's voice. Forget what you saw, Mary. Forget what you heard." Over and over until it became part of me. Mary's recollections come in fragments, like pieces of a shadowed mirror. She remembers being 7 years old when her mother went away. Thomas told the children that Eliza had fallen ill and needed to stay with relatives. Later, the story changed. Their mother had abandoned them, he claimed, and they were never to speak of her again. "He made us practice what to say if anyone asked," Mary reveals. "Edward would cry, but Father would make him repeat the words until he stopped crying." Her eyes grow distant as she recalls the rehearsals, the careful construction of a family myth that would endure for decades. The elderly woman describes how darkness became her constant companion. "I'd dream of Mother trapped in shadows, calling for help. When I'd wake screaming, Father would give me medicine that made the world fuzzy." The substance, likely similar to the tonic mentioned in Eliza's diary, became part of children's routine whenever they showed signs of remembering too much. School became a place of shame for Mary. Teachers would ask about her mother, and she would recite the practice lines while feeling the weight of her deception. "I knew something terrible had happened," she confesses, but saying it out loud felt impossible, like it would make it real. Mary's testimony reveals how Thomas's control extended far beyond Eliza's disappearance. He isolated the children, monitored their conversations, and punished any mention of their mother. When Edward once drew a picture of their family, including Eliza, Thomas burned it in the fireplace while making the boy watch. The worst part wasn't just losing mother, Mary says, a single tear tracking down her lined face. It was losing the right to grieve her, to even acknowledge she existed. Psychologists interviewed for the documentary explain how this enforced silence compounded the children's trauma, creating wounds that would never fully heal. Mary's fractured memories, vivid in some details, completely blank in others, reflect the mind's desperate attempt to both preserve and protect itself from unbearable truth. "Father took more than mother from us," Mary concludes, her voice suddenly stronger. "He took our voices, our trust, our childhood." The camera lingers on her weathered hands, now clutching a small photograph of Eliza that Catherine had given her decades later, the only image of her mother she possesses. The yellowed medical records from Riverdale State Hospital paint a disturbing portrait of Thomas Whitlock's final years. Admitted in 1934 after being found wandering the streets of a small Arkansas town, he spent his remaining days in a fog of paranoia and delusion. The attending physician noted his persistent belief that unseen forces were conspiring to take his property and family, a chilling echo of the control he once exerted over his household. Patient exhibits extreme agitation when questioned about his past, one clinical note reads, particularly regarding his wife and children. Thomas would often ramble about having protected them from unnamed threats, his weathered hands clutching invisible barriers in the air. The hospital staff documented how he methodically checked door locks multiple times each night, a ritual that mirrored his behavior in the Ozark homestead decades earlier. Mary Whitlock, interviewed in her 70s, speaks with trembling hands about the father she both feared and desperately tried to understand. "There were moments of tenderness," she recalls, her voice barely audible. "He would tell stories by the fire, and for a while, everything seemed normal. But these glimpses of normalcy would shatter without warning." Mary describes waking to find her father standing over her bed, whispering about dangers lurking in the shadows. The documentary presents evidence of Thomas's own troubled childhood through county records and testimonies from distant relatives. His father, a drifter with violent tendencies, abandoned the family when Thomas was 9. His mother, struggling with what was likely undiagnosed mental illness, kept the boy isolated from neighbors and school, convinced that outsiders meant harm. "The pattern is unmistakable," explains Dr. Eleanor Winters, a psychologist specializing in generational trauma. Thomas recreated the very environment that damaged him, perpetuating a cycle of fear, control, and isolation. This context doesn't excuse his actions, but offers insight into the twisted logic that governed his behavior toward Eliza and their children. Edward Whitlock, who changed his name and moved to California after leaving home, refused all interview requests until his death in 1982. His wife later revealed that he never spoke of his childhood and would become physically ill when pressed about his parents. "Whatever happened in that house," she states, "it broke something in him that never healed." The documentary juxtaposes images of Thomas's hospital room, sparse, meticulously organized, with photographs of the Whitlock homestead. The parallels are striking. The same rigid order, the same barriers against an outside world perceived as threatening. In both spaces, the camera lingers on windows, portals to freedom that, for Eliza, remain tragically out of reach. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The state hospital records painted a stark portrait of Thomas Whitlock's final years. Yellowed pages documented his deteriorating mental state, paranoid delusions that mirrored the same controlling behaviors that had once imprisoned his family. Nurses noted his obsession with locked doors, his insistence that unknown forces were conspiring against him. In one particularly telling entry, an orderly described Thomas muttering about what's buried beneath during a feverish night. Psychiatric evaluations revealed a man consumed by his own demons. Dr. Eleanor Harmon, who reviewed the case files for the documentary, explained how Thomas's paranoia had likely been building for years before Eliza's disappearance. What we see in these records is the culmination of a psychological pattern that began much earlier, she noted. The seeds were planted in his own childhood. Indeed, further investigation uncovered that Thomas's early years had been marked by instability. County records showed his father had been a violent alcoholic who kept the family isolated from neighbors. Thomas had witnessed his mother's repeated abuse, a chilling parallel to what would later unfold in his own home. The documentary carefully traced this generational echo of trauma, showing how patterns of control and fear had been passed down like a terrible inheritance. It's a cycle that repeats unless something breaks it, explained forensic psychologist Dr. James Whitfield. Thomas recreated the only family dynamic he understood, one built on fear and isolation. Former neighbors recalled Thomas's father as a man who kept to himself and didn't take kindly to visitors, phrases eerily similar to those used to describe Thomas decades later. The camera lingered on photographs of the elder Whitlock homestead, its windows like dark eyes staring out from the past. Most revealing were Thomas's own writings, discovered among his personal effects at the hospital. Scrawled in shaky handwriting on scraps of paper were confessions that never reached the authorities. She knew too much, and had to keep us safe from them, appeared repeatedly, though who they were remained unclear, lost in the labyrinth of his delusions. The documentary drew these threads together, showing how Thomas's paranoia had been both his motivation and his undoing. His final years were spent in a hospital room, not unlike the prison he had created for Eliza. Confined, isolated, haunted by fears only he could see. The tragedy, noted Catherine's granddaughter in a present-day interview, wasn't just what happened to Aunt Eliza. It was that no one recognized the warning signs in time. The silence that protected Thomas was the same silence that condemned my aunt to her fate. Mary's diary, discovered in a weathered cedar box after her death at 78, offered a haunting counterpoint to her mother's account. Where Eliza Whitlock's words were measured and deliberate, Mary's childhood scribblings revealed raw emotion through crayon drawings and uneven handwriting. The pages showed a child's perception of her family's collapse, stick figures of her mother with tears, her father looming large with angry slashes for eyes, and her brother Edward hiding beneath furniture. "Mama said be quiet today," read one entry, accompanied by a drawing of a finger pressed to lips. Another page simply contained the words, "Daddy digging," beside crude illustrations of shovels and dirt. The documentary lingered on these images, allowing their innocence and horror to coexist in devastating clarity. Historians analyzing both diaries noted the complementary nature of their accounts. While Eliza documented Thomas's escalating control and her own desperate attempts to protect her children, Mary unknowingly recorded the effects of that trauma. Her childish observations often captured details her mother had omitted: the sound of arguments through floorboards, the smell of medicine in her mother's tea, the way Thomas would sometimes stand in their doorway watching them sleep. "Children see everything," explained Dr. Eleanor Harding, trauma specialist interviewed for the film. What Mary's diary gives us is the unfiltered truth of a witness too young to understand but old enough to record. Perhaps most heartbreaking were Mary's entries after her mother's disappearance. "Daddy says Mama went away because she didn't love us enough," one page read. "I know that's not true, because she told me secrets." The secrets Mary referred to, promises to always protect her children, were also found in Eliza's final diary entries. The documentary revealed how Mary carried this burden throughout her life. Her adult journals, spanning decades, showed recurring nightmares of digging and darkness. She never married, claiming in interviews conducted in her 70s that she couldn't bear to be trapped again. Edward, who died before the discovery of either diary, had similarly lived a life marked by distrust and isolation. Together, these written testimonies completed a mosaic of tragedy. Eliza's careful documentation of Thomas's control, Mary's innocent witnessing, and even Harriet Bowman's guilt-ridden confessions formed a tapestry of evidence that transcended time. The film showed how trauma echoed through generations. Mary's fear of enclosed spaces, Edward's reported alcoholism, and the grandchildren who grew up with a vague sense of family shame they couldn't name. "What happened to the Whitlocks wasn't just buried in that root cellar," concluded Catherine's granddaughter in the final interview. "It was buried in all of us who came after."